The last time Emily Harper texted her mother, "I'm home," it looked like the safest, smallest sentence in the world, until it wasn't. Emily was 22, the kind of young woman people trusted without even thinking about it. She grew up in a modest house where laughter came easily and arguments didn't linger. Her parents, Rachel and Mark Harper, had built their family around simple rituals: Sunday dinners, birthday candles, long talks at the kitchen table when life got heavy. Emily was the steady one, the sister who remembered appointments, the daughter who called back, the friend who showed up early and stayed late. In her early adulthood, she did what responsible dreamers do. She worked shifts to pay bills and took classes to keep her future moving forward. She didn't live for drama. She lived for progress. Even her social media felt soft and ordinary: coffee cups, study notes, small celebrations with friends, a quiet pride in becoming herself. Then she met Daniel Cross. Daniel was older, his presence muted rather than loud. He didn't charm rooms, he watched them. He spoke carefully, like he measured every word before letting it go. To Emily, that restraint looked like maturity. In the beginning he was attentive in a way that felt almost old-fashioned, sending a "did you eat?" message, offering to pick her up after work, remembering tiny details she didn't expect anyone to notice. Friends described him as reserved. Emily's family called him polite. No one saw flashing warning signs, not at first. He never raised his voice around them. He held doors, shook hands, smiled at the right moments. On the outside, it was the kind of relationship people nodded at: nothing wild, nothing messy, nothing that made you pull someone aside and whisper, "Are you okay?" After only a few months, they moved in together. It happened quickly, the way quick decisions often do when they're dressed up as love. Emily told herself it made sense: less commuting, shared expenses, more time together. The apartment was small but clean, with light that fell warmly across the living room in late afternoons. She bought a plant for the windowsill. She folded her sweaters into the closet beside his darker, heavier clothes. When her mother asked if she was sure, Emily laughed and said, "It's good, Mom." Really? For a while, it did look good. Then the texture of the days began to change. Daniel's patience thinned in small, plausible ways: an edge in his tone when she ran late, a mood that soured a room without any obvious reason. He wanted to know who she was with, why she didn't answer immediately, why her phone had been silent for 20 minutes. He framed it as concern. He called it love. But it didn't feel like love in Emily's chest. It felt like pressure. The apartment grew tense in ways that were hard to explain to someone who wasn't standing in it. Some evenings were normal: dinner, TV, quiet. Other nights, his silence turned sharp, as if it had teeth. Emily learned to read his footsteps. She learned which version of him was coming through the door. When he apologized, he did it with rehearsed sincerity. He blamed bad habits, stress, things he was trying to quit. He promised change with a steady gaze, like a vow. Emily wanted to believe him. She was compassionate by nature, someone who thought people could heal if they were loved correctly. But privately, she began building a different kind of future in her mind. One where she had her own place again. One where she could breathe without checking her phone every few minutes. One where her life didn't shrink to fit someone else's temper. And still, she stayed, just a little longer, because hope is a stubborn thing. Then came the weekend night that started like any other. Emily finished work late, the air outside crisp and dark, streetlights painting the sidewalk in pale amber. She walked up the stairs to their apartment with tired feet and an exhausted smile, thinking only of sleep. Behind a few closed doors nearby, neighbors would later say they heard a disturbance. And then, suddenly, nothing at all. By the time the apartment door closed behind Emily, the building had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm: televisions murmuring through thin walls, pipes ticking softly, footsteps fading down the stairwell. It was just after midnight. She placed her keys on the counter, slipped off her shoes, and exhaled the long breath of someone who had been holding herself together all day. Daniel was already inside. What happened next would later be reconstructed through fragments, sounds remembered by neighbors, data pulled from phones, timestamps frozen in digital records. But inside those minutes, time did not move cleanly. It fractured. Voices rose. Not screaming at first, but sharp, compressed words, the kind meant to wound rather than be heard. A chair scraped against the floor. Something struck the wall. A neighbor paused with their hand on a light switch, listening, unsure whether to intervene or assume it was just another argument behind another door. Then came a sudden, unnatural quiet. After that moment, Emily never sent another message herself. At 12:18 a.m., her phone went still. Rachel Harper noticed before anyone else. Mothers often do. She woke in the early hours with the uneasy sense that something had slipped out of alignment. She checked her phone. No reply. She told herself Emily was asleep. She tried again later. Still nothing. Morning arrived without Emily's usual message. At 7:42 a.m., a text came through from Emily's phone, "I'm okay. Just tired. Talk later." The words felt wrong. Too stiff. Too short. Emily never wrote like that. Rachel typed back immediately. The response didn't come. Instead, Daniel answered. He explained that Emily had worked late, that she'd come home exhausted, that she was still sleeping. He sounded calm. Careful. Almost rehearsed. He said there was nothing to worry about. Rachel tried to believe him. She wanted to. But anxiety doesn't dissolve just because someone tells it to. When Emily didn't show up for work later that morning, and didn't call, didn't text, didn't explain, the unease hardened into fear. Police were contacted shortly after noon. When officers arrived at the apartment, Daniel opened the door without hesitation. He was composed, almost eerily so. He answered questions plainly, stepped aside when asked, and gestured toward the interior as if inviting them into any other ordinary home. But inside, nothing felt ordinary. The air was heavy. The stillness was absolute. In the bedroom, officers found Emily. What had been done to her was unmistakable, and the scene spoke of rage, control, and intent. It was immediately clear this was not an accident, not a moment that had spiraled beyond control and stopped there. Daniel did not resist when he was detained. He did not ask for a lawyer at first. He did not cry. As investigators began piecing together the hours between midnight and morning, a disturbing picture emerged. After Emily's life was taken, Daniel did not flee. He did not seek help. Instead, he remained in the apartment for hours, moving through routines that had nothing to do with shock or regret. He sent messages from her phone. He used substances. He left briefly to obtain more. He returned. All while Emily remained where she had fallen, unseen by the world beyond the apartment walls. Later that day, it was Daniel himself who called emergency services. When asked what had happened, his voice was flat. Detached. He stated plainly that he had killed his partner. He admitted to trying to interfere with what would be found. There was no trembling in his words, no hesitation, no visible sense of loss. For investigators listening on the line, it was the absence of emotion that chilled the most. Emily's family learned the truth in a quiet room at the station, the kind with neutral walls and no windows. Rachel would later say she felt as if the floor had simply disappeared beneath her, as if the world had tilted and never quite righted itself again. By nightfall, the story was already spreading, another young woman, another relationship that looked normal until it wasn't. And this time, there would be no chance to leave. The investigation moved with a speed that felt almost unreal, as if the gravity of what happened demanded urgency. Detectives sealed off the apartment, its ordinary furniture now frozen in time, every object transformed into silent testimony. The plant on the windowsill was still alive. A half-finished cup sat cold on the counter. Life had stopped in one room, but the rest of the space hadn't gotten the message. Forensic teams worked carefully, documenting everything. The evidence told a clear story, one of deliberate action, not chaos. The injuries showed intent. The timing aligned with neighbor reports. The phone data traced a precise digital trail from the last message Emily sent herself to the ones that followed, written by someone trying to buy time. Investigators pulled security footage from nearby streets and shops. Cameras showed Daniel leaving the building in the early morning hours, returning later with small bags, his movements unhurried. There was no panic in his body language. No visible urgency. Just routine. When questioned formally, Daniel did not deny what he had done. He spoke as if he were recounting someone else's story, his tone level, his posture relaxed. He described the argument. He described the moment it escalated. He described what came after with a disturbing lack of reaction, as though the weight of the words never reached him. Detectives noticed how often he centered himself in the narrative, his frustration, his impulses, his need to explain. Emily appeared only as a secondary figure in his account, almost abstracted. It was as if he were describing damage to property rather than the loss of a human life. Meanwhile, Emily's family moved through a fog of disbelief. Rachel replayed every conversation in her mind, every moment she hadn't pressed harder, every time she'd accepted reassurance. Mark became quiet, carrying grief in his shoulders, in the way he stared too long at nothing. Friends gathered in small groups, whispering the same question again and again: how did no one see this coming? They scrolled through photos that now felt cruel, Emily smiling beside Daniel, arms loosely linked, her expression warm and trusting. The images looked normal. Happy, even. That normalcy became part of the horror. As news of the case spread, public reaction followed quickly. Comment sections filled with shock, anger, confusion. People who had never known Emily felt connected to her story, recognizing pieces of their own lives in hers, the fast-moving relationship, the subtle control disguised as concern, the belief that patience could fix what was breaking. Experts would later describe the pattern as familiar. The rapid commitment. The isolation. The apologies paired with promises. The cycles of tension and calm. But for Emily, those patterns weren't theoretical. They were her daily reality, navigated quietly, without fanfare. The case file grew thicker by the hour. Messages. Timestamps. Reports. Each page reduced a life to evidence, and yet, collectively, they painted a picture too vivid to ignore. Daniel was formally charged within days. He showed no visible reaction when the charges were read aloud. No lowered head. No shaking hands. Just a distant stare, as if already somewhere else, untouched by consequence. For Emily's family, the legal process had barely begun, but the loss had already settled in permanently. The future she had been quietly planning, the apartment of her own, the independence she was inching toward, had vanished overnight. And the world she left behind was only just beginning to understand how dangerous normal can look. Court proceedings began quickly, driven by the sheer volume and clarity of evidence. There would be no drawn-out mystery about who was responsible. The only questions left were why, and whether the legal system could make sense of something so senseless. In the courtroom, Daniel appeared smaller than he had in photographs. Dressed plainly, shoulders relaxed, he listened as prosecutors outlined the case in careful, measured language. They spoke of timelines and messages, of movements captured on cameras, of choices made hour after Emily was already gone. Each fact was delivered without drama, because the facts themselves were heavy enough. Emily's family sat together, hands clasped tightly. Rachel kept her eyes forward, fixed on a point just above the judge's bench. Mark stared at Daniel for long moments, searching his face for something, anything, that looked like humanity. He didn't find it. Experts testified about patterns of controlling behavior, about how emotional volatility often escalates when a partner begins to pull away. They spoke clinically, but the implications landed hard. Emily had been preparing to leave. Her independence, her quiet plans, had become a threat to someone who needed control more than connection. Phone records were projected onto screens. The unnatural messages sent from Emily's device were read aloud. The courtroom fell silent as everyone absorbed the deliberate attempt to create normalcy where none existed. It wasn't just the taking of a life, it was the calculated delay, the manipulation of a mother's trust. When Daniel's recorded call to emergency services was played, his voice filled the room. Flat. Unemotional. Almost bored. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. One woman pressed her lips together, fighting tears. The absence of feeling was louder than any outburst could have been. Daniel chose not to contest the evidence. He entered a guilty plea. There would be no trial drama, no competing narratives, no attempt to shift blame. The plea confirmed what everyone already knew: Emily had been taken by the person who claimed to love her. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Daniel, describing the severity of the actions and the irreversible harm inflicted, not only on Emily, but on every person who loved her. The words, life imprisonment, echoed through the courtroom, followed by a long minimum term before any possibility of release. Daniel did not react. No visible anger. No collapse. No apology. Emily's family were given the chance to speak. Rachel stood, her hands trembling, and described her daughter's kindness, her reliability, her future. She spoke of texts sent from the wrong hands, of a mother's intuition dismissed too late. Her voice broke only once. When it was over, the courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the air felt different, too bright, too normal for what had just been sealed inside legal language and stamped with finality. Justice, in its formal sense, had been served. But nothing had been restored. Emily was still gone. In the weeks after sentencing, life outside the courtroom moved forward in ways that felt almost offensive to those who were grieving. Traffic continued. Cafes opened in the mornings. People laughed on sidewalks. For Emily's family, the world had split into two versions, before and after, and only one of them made sense anymore. Rachel kept Emily's room exactly as it was. The scent of her shampoo lingered faintly in the air, a detail so small it could unravel her in seconds. Mark threw himself into routines, fixing things that didn't need fixing, staying busy until exhaustion forced sleep. Grief settled differently in each of them, but it never left the house. Friends organized a memorial filled with soft music and photographs. Stories were shared about Emily's kindness, how she checked in when others forgot, how she showed up with soup and patience, how she listened without judgment. The same sentence echoed again and again: she deserved so much more. Public conversation around the case didn't fade quickly. Commentators, advocates, and survivors spoke out about warning signs that often go unnoticed: how control can masquerade as care, how jealousy can be framed as devotion, how apologies can become tools rather than truths. Emily's story became a reference point, not because it was unique, but because it was painfully familiar. Her parents agreed to speak publicly once. Not for attention. Not for closure. But because silence felt dangerous. Rachel spoke carefully, urging people to trust discomfort, to listen when something feels wrong even if it looks fine on the surface. Love shouldn't make you smaller, she said. And fear shouldn't be mistaken for commitment. Daniel was transferred into the prison system, where his days would be counted in routines and locked doors. There were no dramatic outbursts reported. No attempts to appeal. He faded from headlines quickly, his name becoming less important than what he had done. Emily's name, however, remained. It appeared in conversations between friends checking in on each other. In training sessions about relationship safety. In quiet moments when someone decided to leave before it was too late. Her future had been taken, but her story began doing something she never intended, protecting others. Still, for those who loved her, awareness didn't equal healing. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived with one chair permanently empty. The pain changed shape over time, dulling at the edges but never disappearing. Emily had been planning a different life. And in honoring that truth, her family refused to let her be remembered only for how it ended. Time did what it always does, it moved forward, indifferent to loss. Seasons changed. The apartment where Emily's life ended was cleaned, repainted, and eventually occupied by strangers who would never know what had happened there. Walls can be scrubbed. Floors can be replaced. What remains is never visible. For Emily's family, grief became quieter but heavier. It showed up in ordinary moments, when Rachel reached for her phone to send a message that had nowhere to go, when Mark caught himself listening for footsteps that would never come through the door. Grief was no longer sharp, it was constant. A low ache that settled into daily life. They learned how to speak her name without breaking every time. Emily became more than a headline, more than a case file. She became a reminder. A reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. That control can arrive softly, wrapped in concern and apologies. That relationships can look stable, loving, even enviable, right up until they aren't. People who never knew her carried her story forward in quiet ways. Someone chose to leave sooner. Someone trusted their instincts. Someone checked in on a friend who seemed distant. These changes were small, invisible victories, but they mattered. Daniel would spend the rest of his life measured by locked doors and concrete walls, his freedom permanently replaced by consequences. There would be no redemption arc, no explanation that made sense of what he had done. Some acts are simply final. Emily's life, though short, left an echo that outlived the violence done to her. She was more than the last night. More than the apartment. More than the man who tried to erase her voice. She was a daughter who called home. A friend who listened. A young woman who believed in kindness, even when it cost her everything. And her story stands as a warning written not in fear, but in truth. Sometimes the most dangerous endings begin inside relationships that look perfectly normal, until it's too late to walk away.